Welcome back. We're going to continue with this discussion of the unification of Germany and the series of small wars that Bismarck provoked in order to hasten the unification of the German peoples under Prussia's rule. Bismarck, perhaps the most skillful diplomat of the 19th century in Europe. He lived from 1815 to 1898. In September of 1862, he was made the provisional head of the Prussian government, and then in October he was appointed as Prime Minister of Prussia. Bismarck has been called a realist in politics, and an exponent of something that we think of as uniquely modern, that is the practice of realpolitik, the politics of reality, without perhaps taking into regard or into account any sort of sentimentality or morality in the conduct of international relations. So I'm going to characterize Bismarck here for a few moments so you can get a sense of his mentality and how he approached diplomacy. Bismarck's gift was to recognize his own limitations and the limitations of Prussia, the state he governed. Bismarck, like Richelieu, whom we talked about earlier, regarded politics as the art of the possible. And his maneuvers to achieve the possible were quite skillful. You can think of Bismarck as an artist in diplomacy, the same way you might think of Napoleon as an artist in war. Like Napoleon, and I'm talking about the original Napoleon here, like Napoleon's campaign strategy, Bismarck's power was never bound by fixed rules or preconceptions. Very flexible, pragmatic diplomat. Bismarck did not only take into account the most obvious moves of his opponents, he was prepared to deal with every conceivable move, even blunders, on behalf of his opponents. Bismarck's outstanding quality was his ability to choose the most opportune and the least dangerous political course. Bismarck was keenly aware that politics presents a constant succession of alternatives, and that there is rarely one solution to a political problem. Let's further characterize Bismarck and Prussia. Bismarck's peers, that aristocratic class, the Junkers in Prussia, they were loyal to the king and they were loyal to the kingdom of Prussia and to their class. But Bismarck was a little different. He sort of emancipated himself from these restrictions or this provinciality. In a time, he moved from being a Prussian aristocrat to a German statesman, and then finally, I think, to a true sort of European with the ability to see the entire continent, and then perhaps even to a global point of view. So an exceptional diplomatic actor here. The keystone of Bismarck's system was the German Empire, the empire he created, and he maintained a diplomacy to protect that German empire. That was the focus of all his energies. Bismarck possessed that most rare quality of men of political genius, moderation, the ability to know when to stop or where to draw the line. Unlike Napoleon, the great Napoleon, Bismarck was never a political gambler. Everything was calculated carefully and completely. Bismarck never staked the outcome or the future of his state or his own career on the outcome of a particular battle or political experiment. Bismarck did not wage war until he had ascertained that all other means had been exhausted and that all possible odds, military, diplomatic, and moral, were on his side. Bismarck's wars were fought with a clear and limited purpose. When Bismarck decided that the advantages to be gained by war were no longer justified the risk involved, he became Europe's staunchest defender of peace. Again, looking after or maintaining the power of this new German state, the focus of his energies. Now, let's look at a little more specifically at Bismarck's diplomacy. He said again and again that Germany must keep Russia close. Do not allow Russia to become a hostile state to Germany. And he practiced this assiduously over the course of his career. When there was a revolt in Poland, and Poland at this point was a province of Russia, many liberals in Western Europe, in France and in Great Britain, were sympathetic to the Poles. Again, it's this sort of rising nationalism in the sense that the Poles deserved their country, just as other peoples had formulated their national ambitions in the shape of independent and sovereign states. Bismarck did not go along with this. He regarded Russian friendship as much more important than supporting the rising nationalist ambitions of the Poles, who were dominated by the Russians. In fact, he dispatched military forces to Poland to help contain any sort of Polish revolt and to show his support of Russia. And of course, there are many Poles living in eastern Prussia, or the eastern part of Prussia, and he didn't want those revolts to spread there as well. So this support of Russia tended to bring the two states closer together, Bismarck's Prussia and the Tsar's Russia. Now, let's look at Bismarck's diplomacy with regard to the other great German state, Austria. There are two German provinces located in northern Germany, contiguous to Denmark, Schleswig and Holstein. Bismarck maneuvered Austria into an awkward position here. Austria and Prussia agreed to maintain joint sovereignty over these two small German duchies. But he created a situation that made it possible to engineer an incident between Austria and among the great powers by isolating Austria. Now, before this conflict with Austria, Bismarck had to convince both the emperor and his military staff that indeed Prussia was well suited, if a showdown came, that Prussia was prepared to defeat Austria. Now, after the defeat of Austria in 1866 at Sadowa, Bismarck had to restrain the Prussian king and the Prussian military from humiliating Austria. Again, Bismarck's wars are limited in scope. And he realized with Russia on one side and France on the other, Prussia being in the center, could not afford to prolong the war against Austria and to give these great powers a chance to intervene, or to make Austria and the other defeated German states into bitter and irreconcilable enemies. Again, moderation, knowing when to stop, achieving your political goals, and then ending the hostilities. Bismarck's one big claim in the war against Austria had been the expulsion of Austria from German affairs. And this he accomplished. And he did it without annexing any Austrian territory or without staging any sort of triumphal march through Vienna that would humiliate the Austrians, without serving any practical purpose. So we just have a glance here at Bismarck, his relations with Russia, a glance at Bismarck and his relations with Austria, and now just a quick glance at Bismarck's diplomacy with France. Prussia's remarkably rapid victory over Austria in 1866 had ruined the plans of Napoleon III. Napoleon III had counted on a long war in Germany that would exhaust both Prussia and Austria and permit France to sort of dictate the terms of peace. And again, we go back to the incident of the Spanish throne being open and a Prussian prince being invited to occupy that throne. This, of course, infuriated the French. But France, being seen as a much more powerful state than Prussia, had to be careful in its diplomacy. And this, of course, is something that Napoleon III was unable to do. If France directed its wrath against Prussia, Prussia would be made to appear an innocent victim of French bullying and French aggression. if France chose to go to war with Prussia over the issue of a Prussian king on the Spanish throne, their international position would be very weak and unlikely to attract allies. The Prussian prince who we're talking about here is Prince Leopold. When his candidacy was announced for the Spanish throne, this was publicized, and the French were given ample opportunities to take countermeasures. They brought pressure to bear on both the Spanish and on the Prussian government to stop this candidacy of Prince Leopold from becoming a ruler of Spain. But there were powerful elements in France that wanted more than just the elimination of this candidacy by a Prussian prince. The Prussian king, Bismarck's boss, yielded to French arguments and decided to withdraw the candidacy of Prince Leopold. So it looked as if the French had scored a great triumph here. They had pressured the Spanish and they had pressured the Prussians to end this candidacy of a Prussian prince taking over the Spanish throne. And instead of showing moderation in this diplomatic victory, they tended to crow about it. And this would rebound in a way that was disastrous for both Louis Napoleon and for France. After this candidacy had been withdrawn, the French demanded that the King of Prussia, Bismarck's boss, write a letter to Napoleon III and apologize for all the trouble that Prussia had caused by putting forward the candidacy of Prince Leopold. When the Prussian king received this letter, he sort of politely dismissed it, but he sent an account of this letter to Bismarck. Now, Bismarck will take this letter and will turn it into a provocation, inviting French aggression, with Bismarck knowing that Prussia would be able to take advantage of this situation. So we'll talk about the Franco-Prussian War that results in our next session. Thank you.